Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to you all on this beautiful summer's day. So my name's Bart Hallmark, and I'm going to be your host today. So the webinar you're about to be part of is provided by FJ Wilson Talent Services, who are a talent acquisition and development service. And the guidance that you're about to hear today is based on FJ Wilson's experience of recruiting for mid to senior level professional roles. So the topic of today's webinar is all about presentations, and we've termed this advanced presentation skills, going from good to great. And I'm absolutely delighted to have with me today Anthony Haynes, who is Communications Director of FJ Wilson and who is an expert in this area. So Anthony, welcome.
Thank you, Bart. Greetings and a good afternoon or good day to everyone, wherever you are in the world. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. So to our audience, a little bit about how this webinar is going to work. So during this webinar, we're going to provide 3 sets of suggestions for you. Now, these suggestions come in the form of pre-recorded audio segments. And whilst these audio segments are playing, if any questions occur to you, please do drop them in the chat that you'll see on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. After each recorded segment has finished, we'll have some live question and answers with Anthony to answer any questions that have come in. Now, if we get lots and lots of questions, we might have to be a little bit selective and perform some triage. So please don't be upset if we don't get around to answering your question, although we will endeavour to do what we can, but also endeavour to do what we can to maintain stick within time limits. In terms of the chat, it's a completely moderated chat. So any questions that you ask will be blind to the rest of the audience. And rest assured that I won't be reading out anybody's names when we come to deal with questions later. So it's in complete confidence. So without any further ado, let's go on to our first segment, which is all about the fact that, well, presentations are more than just a slide deck.
So let's start with this fundamental point about presentations, which is that the words slides and presentation are not synonyms. A presentation is more than a slide deck. Sometimes when I'm giving presentations, I get asked in advance by an administrator something like the following: could you please send me your presentation beforehand? To which the honest answer is, no, I can't, because it hasn't happened yet. And in that question, could you send me your presentation beforehand, are 2 assumptions. The first assumption is that I will definitely be using slides. Well, I do quite often use slides, but I don't inevitably use slides. And the second assumption is that that's all there is to a presentation, that the presentation is made up of a set of slides. And if you think of it that way, you're failing to see presentations as an experience, as a human interaction. So to escape these assumptions, I think there's a set of questions that a presenter can run through when they're preparing. The first question is this: do I have any material that needs to be presented visually? Because if I don't present it visually, I'm unlikely to communicate it effectively. So an example would be a map of something. If a map has any real complexity at all, it's probably going to work much better visually than if you try and present the information verbally. But you might not have any such material, and if it's perfectly reasonable to present the material verbally, you have to ask yourself, what's the point of slides then? Why do I need those? If you do have material that you think needs to be presented visually, the next question to ask is, okay, I'm going to use slides to do that. Can I restrict my slides purely to those parts of the presentation? So the parts of the presentation that will work well purely verbally, well, we don't need slides for those, but what you can do is then produce slides specifically for the parts where you're trying to communicate something visually. And then the next question to ask is, how can I maximize the interaction with the audience? Because I said earlier, the problem with equating slides with presentation is it ignores the fact that a presentation actually consists of an experience, an event, a human interaction. And there are 2 ways of maximising this interaction. One is actually literally asking the audience to do something in response, and that may be have a vote. How many people think this? How many people think this? Or could you put your hand up if you've ever done the following, just so that the audience have some engagement with you. And the second way of doing it is actually to stimulate engagement internally, in other words, just in their mind. Like, I'm going to ask this question, I'm going to explore this question. I'll just give you a moment to kind of reflect on it and ask yourself what you think the results are going to show. And it just stimulates a bit of sort of cognitive activity on their part that keeps them engaged.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Anthony. I think very, very sound advice there. Very, very useful tips, and also probably things that don't necessarily occur naturally to folk who are in the presenting seat. So thank you to our audience for submitting some questions. Very much appreciated. We'll do our best to work through those. So the first question that we've had, Anthony, is that if you don't use many slides, or let's take the extreme case, if you don't use any slides, don't you convey the impression that you haven't prepared anything?
No, I don't think you do. And I say that quite confidently because most of the time when I have to do a presentation, I do use some slides, but I don't always. And in fact, this week is an example of 2 presentations a couple of days ago where I didn't use any slides. I never get that comment. And I know I've coached a number of people who do presentations, for example, as part of job application selection process. When I've asked them, they don't get that comment either. So let's just unpack that a bit.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
If you go into a presentation with no slides, and also you've done no kind of practice and no planning and no preparation, and it's all a bit shambolic and overplayed, yes, you will get criticised for not having prepared properly because you haven't. But if you've got something which is coherent and it's fluent and it's obviously structured, and you can draw attention to that at the start of the presentation, you can say, what I'm planning to do in this presentation is I'm going to cover this, 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 and this. And as soon as you say that, it shows you know where you're going. You're not winging it. And at that point, you don't get, that knocks out of court this idea that you're not prepared. So you show that you've been professionally prepared by the fact that people think, oh yeah, that was clearly structured, and yeah, I understood that. That was kind of well articulated and courteous to the audience in the way that you structured it. And no one will then say, oh yeah, but there weren't any slides, so it wasn't any good.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And I suppose your point there really does emphasize this whole thing about it's an experience. It's far more than just a slide deck. And it's the way in which you use different methods to communicate and different methods, maybe dare I say, to teach, that can give the overall impression and in terms of sort of audience look and feel. And I suppose in many ways, maybe myself included here, it takes a lot of confidence to do that, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It takes a bit of nerve. So I would certainly do a practice run with someone. And in fact, I mean, very often there is something in the presentation that is helpful to communicate visually, such as you might have a graph about something, all right? Table of results or something. Well, so in most cases, there's a question there about how do you minimize the slides rather than necessarily avoid them altogether. But let me just put the case for avoiding them altogether if you don't have specifically the visual material. In a job application, you're often job selection process. You're often in quite a small room, and you've got, let's say 3 people interviewing you, and you're sitting around a table. It's not a lecture theatre and so on. And actually, it can be quite awkward. Like you plonk your laptop down, and there's a bit of fiddling around to get it set up, and then there's this sort of thing about, well, where do you look? When are you playing around with the computer to get the right slide on, and are they looking at the computer or are they looking at you? And it just all feels a bit embarrassing. So there are actually some arguments in terms of confidence and having nerve. There are actually some arguments on both sides.
No, that's a very interesting point, actually. And actually, sticking with the theme of job applications, had a very pertinent question come in, which is, would you recommend a document to send in afterwards in that scenario, in sort of an interview presentational style, in order to recap your presentation as an alternative to showing slides?
Yeah, I think that can be very, very helpful. It's a question about when you issue the document. I mean, do you give it or send it to them beforehand, during, or after? There are different arguments about that. I think the thing to try and avoid is, if you're actually going to be giving out a document, a handout, I try not and do that in the middle of a presentation, because it's amazing how it creates kerfuffle. Someone drops a bit of paper, one person takes 2 copies, and then the other person hasn't got anything. And particularly if there's more than one page, people will just find a way of getting in a muddle, and someone ends up with all of page 1s and no page 2s. It's just a disaster. And they've broken the concentration. You can't get them back. It's like trying to use a dog that is not trained as a sheepdog to try and get the sheep in the right place. It just won't happen. So if by all means, give them out at the start and staple them together, and put a very clear page number if you got more than one page. But yeah, I think handouts can, they still have a place, actually.
Okay, that's really useful. I mean, coming from an educational background myself, handouts were effectively mandatory in many ways. But it's interesting to see how there's far more nuance that they can be put to in different scenarios, which is really interesting. So we've had another really pertinent question come in around topics of presentations, and this is related to what we're talking about. And how would you prepare for something? For example, there's a very common presentation topic at senior level, I'm told, which is, what would you do in the first 90 days to establish priorities and make an impact in this role? And so in terms of a strategy for presenting that verbally or visually, I guess a lot of it's going to be context dependent, but are there any sort of threads and rules of thumb that you'd sort of advise for that?
You're putting me on the spot there. That's
absolutely
quite a difficult one, but I'll try and answer. I think maybe I'm doing someone's work for them here, and they've got an interview coming up, which is fine. So off the top of my head, I think the thing that strikes me there is it's about the pragmatism of being simple. So, there might be dozens of things that you would do in the first 90 days, but you're not going to manage to put dozens of things into a presentation. And if you do, people will lose the will to live before you get anywhere near, it near the end. And so I'll just mention there, I use the word mention advisedly, ironically. People often have what I call a mentioning mentality, right? Which is the feeling of, I must mention this, I must mention that, I've got to mention that. And if they do a rehearsal with one of their friends or peers beforehand, quite often the reviewer there will say, oh, don't you think you ought to mention this? Don't you think? I want to say there, calm down, because actually, if all you're doing is mentioning things, that has a very thin kind of utility. Like, you're probably really not achieving very much, and what you're actually doing is clogging the whole thing up. So I think boldness, clarity of outline. So you can say things like, well, what I'm about to say it's obviously not a complete answer. It doesn't cover every dot every I and cross every T, but I want to give you the main outlines. And then I'd stick with a small number. I mean, people who listen to our podcast will know that actually very often, in fact, nearly every episode, when we're discussing a complex issue, we use bronze, silver, gold. So, well, actually, here's my bronze idea, and here's my silver idea, and here's my gold idea. And what we find, the reason we use it is we find people really like it. Like, first of all, they know where the end is coming. They kind of quite like that. The ascending order means it kind of gets, like it gets more and more interesting. But people just kind of like it's just the simplicity of the thing is what they
Yeah, no, I think that's really good advice. And also spans very broadly across the whole topic of presentations in terms of, don't overcomplicate the message that you're trying to convey. Try not to convey too many messages in the same presentation, otherwise it's impenetrable, and I think again the audience just lose the will to live at some point. And try and keep a nice clear story so that people can navigate their way through it.
I think the analogy there is juggling. Like, I'm a really, really useless juggler, but I can probably just about juggle one ball. And if you give me two balls to juggle, I'm struggling. And if it's four, it's not going to happen. And you're asking the audience, if you've got lots of different points and lots of different themes and questions, you're asking them to juggle too many balls.
Yeah, absolutely. So one final quick question, which comes back to the whole visual nature of presentations, which is, okay, so let's say, for example, I've got a presentation where I've decided maybe 25 to 30% of the time I don't need any visual aids, and I am just going to talk and to explain and engage in a different way. What does one do with a projector? Because some projectors at that point have a blank screen option, which is wonderful, and you can turn it off and it's no longer a distraction.
Yeah.
Others don't, and you just got this great big light shining on a wall that people seem mesmerised by and just sort of stare at in sort of semi-horizon, and completely lose track of the fact there's somebody there talking and trying to engage. Yes. So what is there a strategy that you can recommend in that kind of scenario?
Yes, and you're right to point out this as a risk, because I'll say quite candidly, I've fallen foul of that risk. I've sort of not given enough thought to that, and then it doesn't go so well. So I think if you have a blank screen option, go for the blank screen. I to be honest, it looks really professional, rather than just leave the last slide on, even though it's now got nothing to do with what you've gone on to talk about. Actually, just blanking the screen looks very professional, and you recapture people's interest. Like, if they've been looking at the screen, they then look at you. So that's a powerful communicative tool. The other thing you can do is just have a sort of fairly meaningless, blank slide, or slide with nothing on it except a logo or a name or something like that.
Or I guess maybe even just a blank slide.
Well, yes, that's what I mean. It can be a blank slide. Yeah. And incidentally, I kind of feel it's good to avoid an all-white background, because it's very garish. It's very harsh on the eyes. So just using a very faint colour, like a faint yellow or faint grey, where it's so faint that they don't particularly notice it. So, oh, there's a grey slide. It's not white. It's not garish.
Absolutely. No, I think that's really great advice. Thank you, Anthony, for that really interesting discussion. I think that was very, very valuable. Thank you again to our audience for submitting some good, challenging questions there. That's very much appreciated. So let's move on to the next segment of advice, which is the fact that slides can usually have more than one function. So let's consider what the function of slides are.
I work very frequently with presenters, and typically they spend a lot of time working on their slides. And I have to say, I have to be candid and say I am absolutely amazed at how little of that time they typically spend reflecting on the function of the slides. What are the slides actually there for? And it's worth saying, usually there's more than one function. In fact, usually there are three functions going on. The first function is that people use slides to present themselves with a script, to remind themselves what it is that they're going to say. The second function is that they use slides as visual aids. That is, they're resources to help the audience understand, to make sense of what it is that you're talking about. And then the third function is they act as a reference resource, something for the audience to take away and look back on later as a reminder, so they can check the details of what you said and so on. Now, if you think about those three functions just for a moment, they're very different from each other. And because they're very different from each other, you have to ask yourself the question, what are the chances of any single set of slides being optimized for all three functions at the same time? And the answer surely is 0. It's not going to happen. So if you optimize the slides for one of those functions, they'll be suboptimal for the other functions. So I think the conclusion from that is inescapable. But if one needs a set of slides, the optimum is to prepare more than one set of slides. The role of the slides as a script for you to follow, you can probably take that out of the frame, because it actually, with most software, you can put words on the screen that you can see that the audience can't see, so they don't need to be on the slides. And in any case, you can prepare other kinds of prompts. I mean, I often use good old-fashioned prompt cards. Actually, there's nothing wrong with them. They don't. The information doesn't have to be on the slide. With the reference set of slides, one often wants to put more detail in. So I'll give 2 examples. It may be you want to provide links to web pages. That's actually a very helpful function of presentations. But they don't work as visual aids. They look terrible if you just put the URLs on the slides because they just clutter things up. And similarly, you might want to put references. You might want to put references to some paper or study or report or something of that kind. And again, that can be a very helpful function of presentations, is to help the audience go away and look up information for themselves. But complete references, author, title, publisher, place of publication, page number, all this stuff, they can look terrible. They really clutter up slides very quickly as well. And the audience isn't going to actually go and read the paper there and then whilst you're speaking, are they? So it's fantastic to provide a set of slides that has all this stuff on, all the links and references, but just don't use them as visual aids. So you can put your slides optimized for visual aids to help the audience understand things up on the screen, and you can say to the audience, I'm going to refer to a number of information sources and a number of web pages. I haven't put them on the slides, but please don't worry, because there's an alternative set of slides that do have all this, chapter and verse on, and I'll email it to you after the presentation, or it's available on the conference website at this point or so on, so that they can be confident that they can look at those things at their leisure. So the key point here is to say, be honest with yourself. Your slides will not be optimized. However good you are at preparing slides, they will not be optimized for all 3 of those functions at the same time. So rather than try to do that and fail to achieve the target, it's better to prepare more than one set of slides.
Great. Again, thank you, Anthony, for those very, very sound pieces of advice. Thank you again to our audience for submitting some questions. So let's pick the first one from that list. The first one, very practically, asks, well, okay, if you're going to prepare more than one set of slides, doesn't this take quite a long time?
Oh, the answer is no. I mean, it's one of the reasons I do it in my own presentation. I wouldn't do it if it took an awful lot of time. But I mean, if you think of those 2 sets of slides that you kindly put up there, Bart, as an example of sort of one to present as a visual aid, one as a reference. I mean, there was very little thinking to do in terms of transitioning from one to the other. There wasn't really much cognition to do. It's just sort of deleting a few words or adding a few words in. So that really doesn't take very long. And I like to think about in terms of a ratio of how much time you're putting in there in relation to how much effective it's having on the audience. And if by spending these extra few minutes, which is what it will be, streamlining the visual aid slides, if the payoff from that is that your audience is saved from having to look at loads of bullet points and stuff, which are really only there to help you as a script, well, that's a really good payoff. And incidentally, the professionalism comes across as well, because if you do this, if you bother to prepare more than one set of slides, if you're in a group of 100 people, you'll be 1 in 100. The 99 others won't do it. So it is a way of standing out. Thinking, actually, we're a bit slick here. We're a bit ahead of the game.
No, that's interesting. So would you have any advice in terms of which way to approach this? So, for example, one could write the reference set first and have all the detail in there, and then prune that detail back for the things that do get eventually used as visual aids with an audience. Or would you go the other way around, or would you maybe suggest a different strategy?
Oh, good question. So I think that's partly a matter of your personal style, your thinking style, and partly a matter of how much experience you have. So when I do presentations now, which I do quite a lot, I tend to produce a very simple visual aids first, with just keywords, not sentences, not lots of addresses on it and all the rest of it. And then I produce an amplified version. Now, I think I can do that, frankly, because I'm kind of quite used to thinking in that way. And I've trained myself. The question I'm thinking about when I'm doing a presentation is, what's the story, right? And so I find that if you think about the story, that helps you just produce these uncluttered, simple slides. On the other hand, there will be people here listening to it feeling a bit nervous about this, because it's not how they've done in the past, and they kind of have a certain comfort in having quite a lot of information on the slides. And I understand that. If you're in that camp, I would suggest, okay, allow yourself, because basically what you've got there is a desire somewhere in you to get lots of stuff on the slides. So I would say, okay, let's kind of let's indulge that desire by doing the first set with loads of content and lots of detail, and then let's try and cut that down to the slides you're going to actually present to the audience.
No, that's interesting. And having just come off the back of a summer school myself, there's quite a few interesting subtleties, I think, in preparing reference sets and visual aid sets. And one of the pitfalls I fell into, because we were only asked for a reference set fairly late on in the process, was that I tend to make quite interactive slides. They've got animations to make a certain point, for example. And as soon as you sort of make a PDF version of that, you just get a load of garbage on the screen, because everything on that animation is just there simultaneously. And of course, there actually needs to be a little bit more careful design around how those things are presented in one reference set compared to how they'd be used for a visual aid set, for example.
Yes, and I sometimes found that actually, I prepare the visual aids, the cut down version of the slides first, and then when I start working on the fuller amplified version, sometimes what I find is actually it isn't really a set of slides that's needed there. It's something like, it's a nicely designed PDF with a list of references on, that you can email people.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess that's a really nice point, actually. In a lot of the messaging I think that's coming across is to try and break away from this mindset of slides. There's other ways of making the communication work, be that in person within a room or even afterwards, in terms of how one puts a lot of that information across.
Yes, I think particularly it's worth thinking about what's the rest of the day like for your audience. So in a selection process where they're interviewing 5 people on the same day, think of the number of slides and bullet points they're being asked to look at, and then when you whack on your dozens of bullet points, the attitude is going to be, oh, here we go again, And what I find, what I'm about to say, I'm not saying this happens invariably, so I don't want to over-egg everybody. But I was doing a presentation to a group on Tuesday this week, on Wednesday afternoon, and someone made some comment about PowerPoints, and I said, well, actually, this afternoon's a PowerPoint-free zone. Now, how do you think the audience responds? I didn't get any kind of storm of protest. It's like, oh, great, really? Let's do something different. I mean, really, I just don't think the thing that people are itching for you to do is to put on the first few score of bullet points.
No, absolutely. And again, it comes back to your point, especially in an interview scenario, of differentiation. How does one differentiate oneself from the remainder of the field? Or in a teaching context, how does one differentiate oneself from other information providers there to make sure that the messaging that you put across is really clear and audience centric?
Well, that's the key thing, isn't it? So we've covered some specific points, and I'm dare to say we'll cover a few more in a minute. But actually, there's an underlying point there, which is, in terms of how do you make yourself distinctive, the answer is really simple, which is nearly everyone, when they're communicating, it doesn't particularly matter whether they're giving a presentation or whether they're making a video or giving a lecture or writing a book or whatever, the person doing that, the pushing, will be bound up in themselves. So what they do is ask themselves lots of first person questions, like, what do I want to say? What's my message? How do I want to present myself? And so on. That's all about me. And in communication, it's very important to do the opposite, which is, well, what will they understand? What do they need from me? What will they enjoy? What will they be looking for out of me? So it's all the second person, like third person. What do they want from this? And so all of those specific techniques that I've just started to go through, underlying all of that is, let's just think what works for the audience, and then you have to say, what's your experience when you sit through the average presentation? They're not doing that.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good point. Thank you. One quick other question. So this refers back to slides and scripting. If you don't use slides as a script, what can you do instead? I know you mentioned prompt cards.
Yeah.
Very, very good. I mean, I've never used prompt cards, or I've used them minimally because it feels there's a visual element there I don't like people seeing. So would you have any other sort of alternatives that would serve that purpose?
I think there are a whole number of. I have to say I improvise a bit, and I don't know. You might not like the improvise. I'll give you one example. It depends how much you know about the location you're presenting in. I mean, there's one place where I do a presentation every year, and they have mobile whiteboards. So I just go and stick a whiteboard sort of next to the audience so that I can look at the whiteboard. You know, and I don't have to turn my back on them. It's just next to them. So if you're using PowerPoint, you can use presenter mode, so you can actually write your script and it will appear at the bottom of the screen, but the audience don't see it, but you can see it. I think that's, I very rarely use that myself, but I do think it is helpful, and I've worked with people who use them. Incidentally, one of the advantages of that is if you're going to glance at it, and incidentally, often in practice, you're not actually following the script, it's just there for comfort because you're worried about forgetting it, right? If you then think, oh, I just need to look at the script there, what you will naturally do is look at it on the monitor, which will probably be positioned in front of you, so you're still looking towards the audience. You won't read it off the screen because it won't be on the screen, so it stops you turning backwards and looking at the screen and breaking away from the audience. So that's a good thing. I hear what you say about prompt cards. I don't think there's anything wrong with prompt cards. They seem to me perfectly kind of simple technology. I like the fact that I can just stick it in my jacket pocket and I know I've got them there, and I'm not relying on any technology which can break down, right? So and prompt cards, again, it gets over this thing of, has he prepared properly? Yes, he has. He's got the set of prompt cards. So I feel there's a bit of a bias against kind of using paper, where actually it's a perfectly adequate technology. Now, here's my big answer to your question, and not everyone in our audience today is going to welcome this. All right, okay. I have to question whether you need a script. I mean, the first thing to ask yourself is, how long is the presentation? The second thing, the big thing, is this: you're going to do some preparation, some practice. Incidentally, don't try and practice verbatim. Don't try and learn it verbatim, because you're not an actor following a play text written by a great playwright like Alan Ayckbourn. That's not what you're doing. And if you try and memorize things verbatim, it will be obvious to the audience you're trying to do it. You'll be giving all your attention to whether you've remembered it verbatim, not giving your attention to how the audience reacting to this. And you're just putting a huge amount of stress on yourself. So the thing that you need to know and have in your memory is, well, what's the overall structure? What's the story? What are the kind of big points that I've got to get in there, which you can remember. So if you've done a proper bit of preparation, you'll find it's there, especially if it's a topic you understand. I mean, most people could talk reasonably lucidly about it without any preparation at all, to be honest. Is, you know, if it's something genuine in your area of knowledge. But why I say think about not using a script, and I do understand a lot of people will want to have a script with them just in case. I get that, but the minute you put the script in, the question you're asking yourself is, are you getting it all in? Like, are you remembering everything? So 2 points. One, supposing you forget to put something in, how does the audience know you've forgotten it? Because they haven't seen the script, so they don't know that you've forgotten it. All right. Secondly, this is a bit that might alarm some people, and I wonder if there's a kind of age thing here, because when I've worked with young presenters, I've never once managed to convince them at this point. I don't know if that is an age-related thing or not. I find that when I forget things, it's because they didn't actually fit into the story. That's why I forgot them. And so it's not that my memory is letting me down. My memory is actually acting as an intelligent editor and saying, "Don't go there. That's gonna muddy the story."
I think that's a really, really good point, actually, and it's all around sort of the framework of the idea and the concepts that need to come across, rather than the absolute nitty-gritty nuts and bolts. And as you say, absolutely rightly, not being afraid to triage the stuff that is of marginal or of no relevance.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So brilliant. Oh, thank you for that. Absolutely fantastic. So let's move on to our final suggestion. And this regards not about the slides themselves, assuming we're using slides, but about the bits in between the slides, the transitions. So let's see what advice Anthony has for us there.
I've spent a good deal of time watching presenters of different levels of professionalism and amateurism. And in particular, I've asked myself the question, what distinguishes the professionals? The people who are really good at presentations, what are they doing that the rank amateurs don't do? Or alternatively, what do they avoid doing that the rank amateurs do? And one of the very clear answers is professionals are much better at handling the transition from one slide to another, and they do it differently from the rank amateurs. So let's look at a bad way of transitioning from one slide to another. This is when the presenter says something like, "So the next slide shows so-and-so," and then they press on their little gadget, and then the next slide comes up, and then everyone looks at the next slide, and then the presenter, after a pause, says, "So this one's about the following." This is a very clunky experience. It's a bit like if you've ever tried to teach someone to drive, and very early on, when they try and change gear, it's never slick and it's never smooth, and everyone in the car lurches as you move from first gear to second gear or whatever. It feels very much like that, and it's very clunky, and it feels very intermittent. The flow of the presentation just never gets going. Whereas what you'd really like is a smooth transition. You remove the trunkiness, a bit like with a really good driver. You sort of just effortlessly move from one gear to another, and no one's really aware of it. And the key to doing that is to change from one slide to another, not at the end of the sentence, but in the middle of a sentence. So you might say something like, "Okay, so we've examined this, and now we need to examine," and as you're saying "now," you press the slide. So you say, "Now we need to examine what happened in 2022. Before you've got to the 2022 full stop, end of sentence, before you've got there, the slide's already up. And then you can start straight away. So now, press the button, we need to examine what happened in 2022. And in fact, in that year, something very significantly changed. And there's a smooth transition there. There's a continuous flow of the narrative rather than a clunkiness. So I think there's a clear lesson from that observation, which is to say, when you watch people rehearsing, very often they're rehearsing slide by slide. And in fact, often that's not particularly necessary because they kind of know what's on each slide anyway. But what they tend not to do is rehearse how we get from one slide to another. And that is the thing that one very definitely does need to rehearse. So I think the lesson that emerges from that observation is rehearse the transitions between slides.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Okay, so thank you for that again, Anthony. I think that's, again, incredibly good advice. And in view of the time, I think we've got time for one question or so. So let me just pick from our list. So thank you to our audience again for submitting some questions. Okay, so this question again pertains to scripting and pertains to ad-libbing. And I know we've just had quite a in-depth discussion on to script or not to script, and I'm absolutely with you there. But what are your thoughts regarding some kind of framework to assist people to learn the transitions? Or is that not necessary?
Well, it's I think one thing to analyse there is what do we actually mean by the word script? And perhaps I should have talked about that earlier. So I'm not at all keen on verbatim scripts because I think they're unnecessary and create pressure on you. Funnily enough, I would be more sympathetic to people using them for the transitions between the slides rather than what they're talking about the slides, because it might come a bit less naturally to them, and it might be something that in the past they haven't really thought about very much, so perhaps they need a bit of support for that. And in any case, these transitions are pretty short, you know, they're a sentence or two. But I think some sort of loose scripting, you know, like a few words rather than an entire sentence. Like, what are the 3 or 4 words that I need to get into the sentence in order to make the transition from one slide to another? I think that's a good thing. But I think very often, you know, when people are rehearsing, particularly if they're rehearsing something else, they do it slide by slide, and they go to this slide and they say, and now what I'm going to say here is, and then I'm going to say this, and then they forget to rehearse the link in between. So that's something to go for.
No, absolutely right. Very, very important indeed. So brilliant, Anthony. Thank you very, very much indeed for a very comprehensive and very erudite set of observations and set of advice there. I think that's very much appreciated. We've got a few minutes to ask a little bit more about FJ Wilson Talent Services.
Okay.
So I know that you provide services to employers and to individuals, but please can you outline a little bit about how you assist job seekers?
Okay, so if those people are actually candidates, in other words, they've applied for jobs that we've advertised, vacancies that we're working on, that gets a lot of support. So we screen people who we think are likely to be successful and to be recommend for employers to interview. We do a screening interview with them one-to-one. And that's an interactive process. And then if people get as far as being selected by the employer for interview, we do what we call prepping. We will prepare people so that they know what it is they're going for. And if we've got some sort of obvious things we want to draw their attention to, we're certainly letting them know, so they're not just walking in, you know, naked, as it were. Now, apart from that, we also provide coaching. So let me mention 2 kinds of coaching. I do presentation coaching. And if you go to our website, fjwilson.com, there's a page called Candidates, and it has some details about how we coach for presentations. I'll just say one thing. Sometimes people regard what we've written on the website as set in stone. It's not, it's negotiable. We can be very flexible about exactly how we work with you on your presentation or presentations. I have to say it's something that I love doing. I find it a very sort of fulfilling, creative thing to work on. So if there are people listening who are interested in that, you're welcome to get in touch with us via the website, and we can discuss that with you. And then our managing director, Fiona Wilson, is a qualified coach, and she will do much more broad-based coaching in terms of, you know, developing your career skills generally, flourishing in the role that you're in, or flourishing in the way that you're seeking to move on to other roles. So there's a bit of detail about that on the website as well. And then you're welcome, whichever form of coaching is most appropriate, you're welcome to contact us.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you very much indeed, Anthony. I think that's been a very, very valuable and useful session. Thank you again to our audience. As Anthony was saying, if you look at FJ Wilson's website, which is fjwilson.com, you'll find all the resources and information that Anthony was outlining. You'll also find on there our schedule of podcasts, which is Recruitment in the Modern World, which gives a lot of evergreen material for both candidates and for employers and for job seekers. So there's a wealth of really useful information there. You'll also find the program of webinars that are upcoming. So we've got a number of webinars planned and in the pipeline. We've got a number of webinars which are going to be on demand as well. And so it'd be great to see you either at a live webinar or to see you have registered on one of our on-demand webinars. So please do make use of those resources, and I hope you find them useful. So the only other thanks I need to give today is to the composer Harry Chalmers, who composed the music that we use on all the introductions and all the concluding segments and all the other bits in between. So thank you to him. So I hope you all have a great rest of the day, and thanks ever so much for coming along. So goodbye then.